of conversations around AI. It seems to be on the top of everyone's mind. But one of the things I'd like to understand from your side of the house, Jeff, is this all hype, or do you think it's a real topic?
Yeah, so I'll give the short version of the answer, which is that I think it's very real.
Hmm.
And I think that one of the things that we can do, especially for folks that are directly engaged in technology, the way that we are, that the way that a lot of the practitioners we work with are, is that it's pretty easy to be skeptical about this because we've seen AI come around before, and we've often seen technologies that get really, really hyped and then they kind of fade away and they don't become
Hmm.
what we thought they were. And that's real and it happens. And I actually think being cognizant of that is really important as a security leader. So that way you can make sure that you're dedicating your time to the things that matter. I think applying those lessons from the past to this iteration of AI in particular is a bit of a mistake. I think it is here to stay this time. I think it is going to impact the work that we do and how we do it. And if you do ignore it, if you do have that kind of natural cynicism and skepticism that's built in over dealing with tech, you're probably going to wind up caught a little bit flat-footed because I don't see it going away, at least in the near term. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. It's one of those things where if the opinion is being made today based off of it being year zero, then we're short-sighted. This is the worst version it's ever going to be, so the results may be mixed at best. We're also seeing a number of organizations, put it in from are we using it public facing? Are we using the generative AI? Are we starting to see the difference between what used to be reserved for the data scientists? But the one thing that I would go so far as to say, especially on the generative AI space, is my background was in risk and governance and compliance. I was working for payments organizations and in fintech for over 22 years before coming over to the Varonis side. And data security was always very important to me, but the likelihood of any risk of exfiltration, of any risk of unauthorized data disclosure or access, it took a lot of time, energy, and effort to get there. But now, with just a natural language search within any of these tools, we're in a scenario where that likelihood is 100%. This is certainly going to surface things based on an access model that's been, for large measure, almost ignored, or maybe not ignored is the right word, but just put to the side because it would take a lot of time, energy, and effort. So that being said, it is here. We are seeing a number of platforms putting it into their systems. We're also seeing organizations at wide talk about this. We're getting the AI, frameworks, and NIST came out with a framework, and we have all these different areas on how are we going to practically use this. But what and how do we help organizations solve doing this the right way, doing this safely and securely? What do you think, Jeff?
I think first and foremost, what most of the security leaders I talk about this with, the first thing that they really have to do is kind of sit down and understand what are the use cases that your business partners are going to be using generative AI for. And not just AI, right? But generative AI specifically. Although one interesting trend I found is that there are a lot of organizations that are now going back and sort of auditing their use of AI throughout the enterprise because they realize and recognize that, oh, turns out we've actually got a lot of AI implemented, like predictive AI. We never secured that because kind of no one cared. And now
Right.
generative AI has caused so much concern that now they're actually being able to go back and improve their security posture on those other implementations, which is great. That's a really opportune moment. But first and foremost, it's really about understanding the use cases so that you can understand what your threat model is, what your attack surface is. Because to your point about surfacing information now, the old way to hack a computer, right, is you had to speak in the language of the computer, which
Mm-hmm.
was a programming language, or you had to know the product or service so well that there was a real intentionality about finding information to use it. To your point, there was a lot of friction, even for authorized users to do what they were supposed to do. And with this new technology, what we're effectively doing is surfacing the ability to get data out of systems without really trying, just by asking a question, just by knowing how to talk to the computer. And so understanding those use cases, right? Is this a situation where your marketing team is going to use this to create abstracts for webinars? Well,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that's probably not something that's too sensitive. You've got some planning. You may
Mm-hmm.
not want to disclose it too early. Versus, is this somehow embedded into your ERP system that includes things like financial data, invoices that could open things up to business, compromises, things like that, where you're paying the wrong people because something's been translated on an invoice or transformed on an invoice without someone even know how to use the application. So to me, one of the big things that's happening now is this is going to put a lot of stresses on the old stuff that we should have locked down already. So if you had weaker processes, that's a problem. If you had poor application inventory, well, generative AI is going to lead to way more applications. So I think this is one of those things, a lot like IoT, where it surfaced and identified a lot of the problems. If you had a network visibility problem under IoT, you had more things on your network now. It made that problem much more difficult. That is what I think a lot of this is surfacing. But to really start, I think you've got to understand the use cases and then understand the threats and the risks based on those use cases so that you can really figure out what your control plane needs to be for this.
And I like, Jeff, where you're thinking and trying to get to the everyone here on this webinar. It's important to understand is that there is processes and there are things that a company is attempting to achieve. And generally those achievements are going to come to either raise that top line or lower that bottom line, but it's a business objective. And if we start thinking about risks to those business objectives and how technology is going to either promote them or mitigate them, this is the bigger conversation to have. And I honestly do think as well, when you start to look back at the CIOs of 25 years ago, it used to be a CIOs coming into a new organization. And we knew the backup software we were going to use. We knew the storage and the compute, and we had all of these things that were, as technologists, let's just put them in. But it had a lot less to do with the business strategy. And security is kind of in that time frame now. And I do believe from an AI perspective, a security practitioner has more of an ability to be a crucial role of how are we looking at risk and how are we gaining that against innovation and productivity so that the strategy is more important than the technology. And the technology is going to allow them to mitigate the risk that's there.
And we're seeing big changes in that vein. One of the things I lead here at Forrester is I lead our global CISO research. So on the role of the CISO itself and how that's changing. And one thing that we're seeing, and it started about 2 years ago, is that we now see more CISOs reporting into CEOs than ever before. And a lot of that is being driven not just by regulation. We've had regulation for a long time. That's always been kind of the monster hiding under the bed for for cybersecurity, right? But what's happened now is that we've got cyber insurers that are putting a lot of pressure, a lot of requirements, but also we're seeing customers and suppliers put more pressure on organizations to have a stronger security posture. And as a result, that really starts to become a situation where security, to your point, can directly contribute to revenue through vehicles like third-party risk management or helping to ensure your security posture is high enough, because an organization, whether it's a supplier, whether it's a customer of yours, is not going to work with you if you actively put their data at risk. Because they know that if you've taken all of the actions you can to secure your environment, but then you work with a partner that hasn't done that, well, you know that they're going to be the method through which your information is compromised, because we see it all the time. And so that's where I'm starting to see CISOs have much more of a hand, not just on that internal aspect of the organization, but also externally facing and driving that customer constituency or using that constituency to prove that, hey, we actually have real business value now. We're not a cost center, we're a profit and revenue center.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would go so far as to say, too, when you look at the way that the CISO needs to operate, and I'm so happy to hear you say that they're reporting into the CEO as opposed to the CIO, because independence is lost, or a CFO that's focused on the P&L and just the general activities of a financial health of an organization. But think about the if you have a product or service to sell and you're interfacing with your customers, and part of your customer contract is we need to make sure that our data and our processes and the things that you're providing to us as an organization are going to be done safe and secure, because we do see that the third parties are a critical path in how we're also identifying some of these breaches that have taken place. I mean, Change Healthcare, for instance. But we have a real opportunity now from a security perspective to be, like you said, it's a profit center. It's core to the business. This is exactly where we're at. And AI is without question driving this to be more important today than it was 12 months ago. And so it's a great position for how are we educating the greater organizations, the greater ecosystems, the greater industries, and just the world at large. And could you tell us a little bit about, maybe what you're doing on the, education or any type of evangelism rather, for the user base?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, one of the interesting things that does make this different than a lot of other technologies historically is that the enterprise is more aware of the threats and the risks
Mm-hmm.
to adoption of AI than they've ever been before. One of the slides I have that I've used at Forrester events in the past is that the day that OpenAI announced its enterprise offering, it was the first time. This is a major technology company coming out with a new product, a new service. The world's excited about it. They have an enterprise offering. It was the first time on a website that above the fold, so to speak, right before you scroll down, I saw things like enterprise security, SOC 2 mentioned, right? We know that compliance is not security. Having a SOC 2 doesn't mean that you're secure. But at the same time, the key takeaway here for security pros is this was the first time that a major technology product on its website, as it launches, launch day, has a press release, has a website that says compliant, secure, SOC 2, ready to go, right? Things like that. We've never seen that before. That just didn't
Right.
exist, right? We didn't,
Right.
cloud's been around for 16, 17 years now, and it took a decade of that before we started getting some of the security documentation. So I
Mm-hmm.
think on one side, we're very lucky in that everyone understands that the security and privacy of data, especially of sensitive enterprise data, is at risk from this, and that the companies that we work with need to place an emphasis on it. On the user side, what I see is a lot of CISOs, thankfully, with the exception of a few verticals here and there, learned a lesson from shadow IT in that their first instinct on the user side was to ban this
Mm-hmm.
technology. And some tried
Mm-hmm.
it. And when they tried it, they were confronted with the inevitable deluge of exception requests from every department that they were suddenly buried under, because now you've banned something that people were using and they want to take advantage of it.
Yep.
So first and foremost, I think a lot of people learned that banning this is not a great choice. And they also recognize that when you ban something, you lose visibility into it. So you don't understand what users are trying to do. So instead, it really came about educating the workforce as much as possible to say, here are the things that you can do, here are the things that you can't do, here are the things you should not do, and trying to enable that as securely as possible. Because I
That's
think
right.
ultimately banning it just didn't work. So I think on the evangelization side, that is a much harder word than it seems like.
Isn't it? Isn't
It
it?
is, it really is. On that particular side of it, I think that we had a lot of lessons from the past we saw that weren't effective. And I think
Yeah.
we also saw security leaders that were very, very focused on enabling adoption, but doing it in as a secure way as possible. And this technology was out ahead of security. It
Right.
undoubtedly was. It
Without
still
question.
kind of is,
Yeah,
but
without
it's
question.
a shorter gap than we've seen with
Mm-hmm.
other technologies historically, which I think is a huge positive for us.
I think it really kind of focuses on the foundation. It's there foundationally when you look at academia, things like principles of least privilege, things like segmentation, things like, your identity management. These are elements that have been in books and education that are very clear, but in a lot of times they may inhibit or impede progress. And there is going to be some position here of where do we have those two intersect and how do they do it in a successful way. And that is the position that at the very least I see out there today, is that it's security is now having to be a core competency. It doesn't matter what you do, it's got to be ingrained in everything you do. So we have to, not every organization, the ones that are creating cars, right? They're manufacturers, for instance, but there's a big technology component. So that had to be inserted into their core competency over some amount of time. And now security has to be inserted into that core competency. It's no longer a necessary evil. It is absolutely something that you need to pay attention to. And there's no reason to talk about fear and uncertainty and doubt anymore. Look at the news. Look at the things that are taking place in popular culture today that we're seeing not in the realm of sci-fi. This is happening in things like, for instance, the morning show. I don't know how many of you watch that, but it's this. This is a common culture. This is a common process. The number of letters that I've had sent to me this year alone of the breaches that have taken place are still astounding. But I'm hoping as some of these technological triggers and revolutions that are taking place, it's going to drive us to a better place and at least a different place that could be better. So we
Yeah.
have, there's so many different things that are out there that are drawing attention. And one of the elements here, as we do talk about AI, is something that's familiar to everyone, right? Everyone in the world uses Microsoft products. And, I remember way back when, with some of the Lotus Notes and some of the off-brand stuff that were taking place, for those of you that do remember, it was a still Microsoft had a pretty significant position. They are the premier leader in corporate IT generally. And what that does with Copilot now, for instance, is that it's embedded, it's AI. We've got things that are going to make our lives easier. Like for instance, we all of a sudden get a log file or something it put into Excel, and we need to make sense of the trend of that data, as opposed to going onto YouTube or trying to figure out or ask your other friends that are Excel gurus, help me make sense of this data. And all of a sudden we can act quicker, we can be more creative, we can be more innovative. But then there's also the element of how it's going to help you surface data. So, now that we're here and we're in a popularity topic here, because it's talked about in boardrooms, it's talked about from the C-suite to the help desk, it is talked about at picnics, it's talked about amongst friends, amongst family. Everyone is talking about things like, but mostly right now because of the marketing, Copilot. So, Jeff, why don't you talk to me a little bit about, you know, what are you doing? What are you seeing? Generative AI, Microsoft Copilot is not the only one in the game here. It was an early adopter, but I think we're going to see more and more. Give me your take on that.
Yeah, I think the Microsoft challenge is a huge one for all of the reasons you mentioned, right? You've got the dominant player in enterprise operating systems. You've got the dominant player in enterprise productivity suites. You've got the dominant player in enterprise computing, not necessarily cloud, but certainly cloud for the enterprise, right? You've got a dominant player there. And Microsoft's strategy, because I've written about this in context of cybersecurity, goes back to an essay written by Joel Spolsky in 2005, which is commoditize your compliments, right? If Microsoft can embed a feature, it's going to do that. I think one of the challenges for security teams right now, because honestly, I'd say of the generative AI questions I get and the conversations I have, which are about 70% of my conversations on a day in, day out basis, I'd say that, about half of those are about Copilot and how to secure this and what to do about it. Because it's being piloted, it's being rolled out to enterprise users. And unfortunately, for a lot of security teams, the first question is the one that's hardest to answer, which is, what all do I need to buy to make this happen from a security perspective? And my answer to that is, well, to figure out Microsoft licensing, I generally would recommend knowledge of astrophysics, the occult, or both, because frankly, they just don't make it that easy to sort through. Do you need Intra? Do you need Purview? Do you need Sentinel? Do you need something else? But it's very, very difficult. And also in terms of protecting your data, how you're going to use this to generate content, if you're taking something from a Word document into PowerPoint or PowerPoint into a Word document, are things like classifications inheriting or not? So how's your data labeling? What's your data governance strategy? Which is a huge topic, because most enterprises I talk to, when I say things like, do you have a mature data governance and classification system? They sort of all start laughing, like, why are you asking me that? Of course I don't. We're trying. But I'm like, okay, well, that's a step, because if you don't have that, then you're effectively asking this solution to protect data that you're not ready to protect or manage. So that's not even completely a Microsoft issue. That's a little bit of an enterprise issue. And so I think that's one of the challenges, but also there's a tremendous appetite for this, because organizations are seeing that there's a real ROI. Even with, and one of my colleagues, JP Calendar, has done a ton of research on this, and I'm fortunate enough to do a lot of sessions with him where he walks organizations through what the actual training requirements are for this. And by the way, approximately, when you look at sort of enabling a workforce with something like Copilot, most companies are kind of underestimating the actual training burden by about 3 times. They're going to need about 3x more training than they think they are, especially for users that aren't technologists. But when you realize that even with that training burden, even if it's 3 times more training required than you think it is, there's still a positive ROI for a lot of roles.
Big time.
So it's worth it as an investment, but then how to secure that from a security leader becomes incredibly difficult. And also, you've got to decide, do you want all your eggs in that basket, or do you want some compensating or complementary controls from other security vendors that leave you with a little bit of distance between being totally all in on that Microsoft ecosystem, which is probably a good idea. And so those are the kind of scenarios and discussions that I'm having. Of course, that spans other ones out there. There's Gemini, there's ChatGPT, and others. But Microsoft, given its place in the enterprise, is certainly one that comes up more often.
Yeah, it does. And again, it's familiarity. I think back to the number of times that I would have to talk to our C-suite or to the board, and those conversations are very different in how they're had. but it's a matter of if I tried to say this was a risk, and I always tried to avoid fear, because as soon as you start with fear, ears turn off and you're just in the way of getting what I'm trying to get done. And I
Yep.
totally understand that. And I think it's a right way for them to respond, because it had to be trained, kind of like AI has to be trained for what are we doing and how are we going to solve some of these significant business challenges. And in addition to, especially right now with AI, if we don't do it, our competitors will. And we're going to
Yep.
have a technical moat between us and them that's going to be very hard to transfer across if we don't start paying attention to this. But it is really something that, with Microsoft's relatability, and it almost seems, and I have to tell people often, when we're having these conversations, I'm not picking on Microsoft at all. They are in front of everybody. They've been in front of everybody for decades. They are the monster in technology, and rightfully so. They have built a system and a company and a number of technologies that are very crucial to how our world runs technologically. But that being said, this is just the start. This is just a
Yep.
start. They're laying that framework, that groundwork that is taking place, and now all of a sudden that springboard's going to be hit, and now we're going to start seeing all of the other companies that are out there that have some capability on getting more out of what you have.
Yeah,
And there was a
and you're
go
right.
ahead.
It's kind of, we sort of point at Microsoft because, to your point, they've earned it, right? That the
Yeah,
reason why we talk
absolutely.
about Microsoft first, but SAP has Joule,
Yep,
Salesforce has Einstein, Google
that's
of
right.
course has Gemini. In their productivity suite, ChatGPT exists, Anthropic with Claude. But there are, virtually every enterprise software offering out there has an embedded capability with generative AI, right? So they have
Sure.
applications, marketplaces, and LLMs galore, and that isn't going to change. That's only going
Nope.
to get bigger. It's only going to get more robust. And unfortunately, from a security perspective, we are charged with securing that. And I say unfortunately because I think in general, whenever you tell a security leader that you have more of something to secure, there's never quite a victory or celebration out of that, right? It's like, oh, good,
No,
I didn't
no.
have enough to do. Now let me do more. But it's
Yeah.
everywhere. And actually, that's one of the big challenges because in a lot of cases, when this is embedded into an enterprise offering that your workforce uses, it may not be a charged feature at first. It's not something you're paying
Right.
for. It's being
Right.
embedded as a feature, a capability, a preview, a public preview version, or something like that. Well, what that means is that if you've gone through a third party risk management process to classify that vendor as level X or Y or whatever, well, would that change if this kind of ability to surface data or information is different? If it would have changed based on that, well, you now need to think about reclassifying that vendor, except they haven't told you that this feature's been added. They might do it in the EULA, but no one reads those. And suddenly now you've got this technology whose capabilities has entirely shifted in terms of what it can do. And security wasn't notified. You weren't told that this
Never.
happened. And right. And that is scary from a security perspective because people are going to be able to do new things with data and you're not going to be able to protect it because you didn't even know that software suddenly had this capability unless you've got fantastic visibility and controls in other places of the network. And again, I think that it's just not pragmatic to expect most security programs to have that.
Well, it's not. It's, especially when you're looking at, from a time, energy, and effort perspective as well, is how much time do you have to get 10 miles wide and 10 miles deep?
Yep.
You're focused on one thing and one thing only. The staffing levels may not be commensurate with the risk that we're trying to combat or even surface, let alone combat. There's a lot of human change element and human change management that has to take place in addition to some of the technology that we're doing, regardless of what it is,
Yep.
security wise, AI wise, whatever the case may be. So it's certainly that third party risk management arm. It's near and dear to my heart. Being head of governance, risk, and compliance, and having third party risk management was a key piece to that. And so many times, again, you go and talk to the business owner and you say, okay, business owner, what are we using this for? And you'd get some level of a definition, and then you'd find out what the data flows are in between, which is very easy for someone to potentially misguide. But if we really don't see what that data is going back and forth, do we really know? And now add in the fact that yes, no one's reading the EULA. Think about, I mean, we're doing this on Zoom today. Think about the outrage that took place when Zoom made a change and they drew it back when it went into the EULA of saying we're going to use the data that's being presented over voice as well as over chat as well as the Q&As and all these things, and we're going to do this in the essence of training our own LLM. Well, it's great, but think about all the topics that we're covering in these types of things. This webinar is meant for public consumption, but there's plenty of meetings that take place that most certainly should be maintained within those closed doors. One other thing that I'll say, and there is a question, and appreciate everyone putting in the questions in chat or Q&A. Q&A helps us get to a little bit better of a cadence here on being able to answer them, making sure that we're covering them. Well, one of the things that I will say for any of the security teams that are out there, and something that I've seen as well as heard about from a number of CISOs that are out there, is we're seeing third-party costs drop. Have we ever in our history seen third-party costs drop? And the reason for that, in some cases, are they using our data to train their LLMs? Are they making it more attractive for us as organizations to adopt and acquire their technology because they're going to make their technology better through our usage and our data? So these are things that it's just, not everything is binary, of course, in this world. We need to understand, we need to dive a little bit deeper, we need to understand, but AI is adding that little extra twist now and a little extra convenience, a little extra, let's say, push and drive to start to make products better. And so one of the topics here, and I know we've got a lot to, we could talk about this for hours and hours, Jeff, I'm sure. One of the topics here that came into the chat was what our thoughts are on just the enterprise level chat GPTs and Geminis. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, again, I think that to the extent some transparency around those solutions is good. They're aware of the enterprise concern, the risks related to these, and have said things like, we're not using your data directly to train the model, which is true, because that's not really how these models work, right? It can't, it's not being trained on the fly. Now, the question that I always follow up with is that it's good for you to ask the following question, which is, are you using our prompts to train? Because you may not be using our data, but what are you doing with our prompts? Because I can almost certainly guarantee you that prompts are being used to train. And by the way, that makes the service better. It may not necessarily be wrong, but think about all of that data in the prompt. And that's where things like, sometimes you hear them called AI security tools, sometimes you'll hear them called AI firewalls, sometimes they're just data security tools. But what I found in general, one of the primary concerns there is that security and IT are log-dependent cultures. That is what we depend on to surface things, right? We need logs. So we need log data to tell us when something good happens, when something bad happens, when something suspicious or malicious happens. That is what our detection, investigation, and response livelihood is kind of driven by, right? It's reactive until we get to things like threat hunting. One of the problems that I've seen that is still a challenge for security leaders, although based on RSA a few weeks ago and other solutions out there, there is movement to solve this, is how do you get yourself between that sort of capability in what a user is doing and the kind of prompt that they're receiving. So the telemetry gap that existed for the last year and a half, frankly, is slowly being solved. But that is definitely something that security teams need. We need the ability to understand prompts, to see what people are looking for, to see what data is coming back. And then we need our governance processes, our investigation processes, our response processes, and detection processes to facilitate whether or not we're comfortable with that kind of information going to that person as someone making a malicious or suspicious request. The other concern that I've seen, and this one is totally real, is, what about a prompt that returns a redirect to a malicious website? Is that stopped, right? We think about our data getting out, but what about just a prompt that sends someone to a website that's hosting malvertising or something else?
That's right.
That's an issue. And so do you have preventive and protective controls that can stop that prompt from being presented to the user so that they can click on it? Because they're going to trust it and they're going to click on it. So things like that, I think, are really important. And we're closing that telemetry gap. There are solutions that are appearing for it, but it didn't exist for a while. So thank goodness that we're finally catching up to it.
Yeah, big time, big time. I have said for almost 2 decades is we could solve 90% of the problem if people clicked 50% of the time. Think about the emails that come in. We go to a website, we see things, and I love to, like, you go into security conferences and people want you to scan their QR code. I certainly wouldn't. That's just, I'm of that mindset of like trust nothing. Unfortunately, especially in the technological world, but it really does come down to, again, we're in year zero. There's a lot of security that needs to catch up, but it's almost catch up to go back in time and lay the foundation down. And that foundation is very key to understand all of the things that we've talked about as security practitioners that have been in the security taxonomy for a very long time, is that these are important. They always were important. It's just a matter of what the likelihood of any of these risks that could exploit them would really come to light. When is that vulnerability going to be exploited? When is the least privilege going to be exploited? This is the type of stuff that is fortunately, it's not like we have to all of a sudden develop a satellite to go into space. We just need
Right.
to kind of go back in time and say, okay, we can't hit the pause button on business. This is moving forward. But what we can do is take a look at foundationally, where are we strong, where are we weak, where do we need to put time, energy, and effort. And there's a number of frameworks that are out there. There are a number of guidances that are out there, depending on where you are in the world, the business that you're in, whether it's a prescriptive compliance or, more of a general baseline type of position. But these have all been talking about this type of stuff, for eons. And now we just need to
Yep.
really put the focus on it. And I think this really goes well into the question that David has put into our Q&A here. It says, do you have suggestions on scaling out security and privacy reviews as third-party vendors start rolling out their AI solutions as part of their existing services across the enterprise? Many just arrive enabled by default, and there are limited options for opting out. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that, Jeff?
I do. So my first thought is that I'm lucky that I work with a colleague, Ala Valente, who covers third-party risk management. So my first answer is I'm going to lay this one kind of bullfighter style, matador style, or whatever, and say you should definitely talk to Ala. But what I will share, because we have done some joint research on this, in fact, we're working on a report right now about kind of securing enterprise software, securing AI embedded into enterprise software.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big things that we've talked about in that is out-of-band reviews. Conducting an out-of-band review. Maybe it's one of those things that you only do from a TPRM perspective when you're going through a renewal, when you're introducing a new product or a new capability. There may be a set of enterprise software that you consider to be so critical, or some that were just under that critical category that you want to conduct an out-of-band review based
Sure.
on press releases or other things. Now, how to scale that? Oh gosh, I mean, that's the hard part, right? We can't always throw people at that problem. I think that's where services can come in. Now, I also cover security services, so naturally
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say, but that is certainly one avenue that we're finding a lot of organizations turning to, is basically saying we can't conduct an out-of-band review because we already have a queue of 100 of these vendors to review. So if I'm going to re-review something, my team's going to quit because they thought they were
No
done with
doubt.
that. So the
No
answer
doubt.
is turn to some services, look for partners out there
Mm-hmm.
that can also facilitate and help you with some of this. So that way it's not all of your people. And then probably for your most sensitive vendors, those are the ones you keep in-house. Those are the ones that you have your personnel focus on. But then for some of those lower tier vendors that are just kind of keeping the queue full, that's where maybe you turn to your services partner. But Ala Valente would be a great person to talk to about that, because
Certainly.
that's her world.
Right. Certainly. I couldn't agree more. When you get into the scenario of the massive amount of third parties, there is very few businesses, and I have yet to talk to one, maybe at the smaller scale, that can survive in 100% on their own.
Yep.
Maybe a woodworker, let's say, they still have to go get tools, but at least there's no information that's transferred between them. But that out of band, everything kind of comes back to risk to me. When I think about what is a third party, who are they, what are they doing, what is the data they're collecting, what is the impact it has on my business from a dollar amount, what if they went down from an availability perspective or a reputation, whatever the case may be. We need to understand data flow, and that kind of gets into, what data do we even have visibility on the data that they're getting, how they're using it, how are they accepting it, how are they collecting it, how are they doing any type of the storing and the processing and the transmitting. There's so many different ways to look at how data is being impacted, and everything, for large measure, especially what I've seen, in the spaces that I've been in, it all kind of comes back to data. Everything that we're doing around the security ecosystem, for large measure and large majority, is to protect the most valuable asset that we have. And when we are talking about things like AI, we're absolutely talking about data, no matter
Yep.
which way it is. That's
Because that's what it's
that's
built on,
key.
right? That's what it requires.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's very cool to at the very least, it's, again, this is a position of where do we take the next step in the evolution? How do we get back to the foundation and fortify that foundation and start doing things that are the basics? And we're going to be in a much better place if we do that across so many different spaces that are impacting the organizations that are out there.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So we have another question in here, and it's good. It's we talked about, and Jeff, you talked about specifically the ROI of AI. So the question here from Andrew Cunningham is, in terms of ROI, have organizations benefited from aggressively implementing AI tools like Copilot, or are the security concerns like data governance and access controls worthy of addressing fully prior to embracing AI?
Yeah, so there is legitimate ROI,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. And again, even when you factor in some of the training requirements and things like that, even when you factor in some of the security controls that you need to add on top of it, there is still an ROI, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
definitely a productivity gain, whether you're talking about developers, whether you're talking about sort of frontline employees, rank and file, whatever it may be. One example would be, and I grew up in a SOC, in a security operations center.
Mm-hmm.
So the SOC and threat detection and response and investigation are near and dear to my heart. But when I talk to a security analyst that's able to use one of these technologies to write an incident report up instead of having to sit there and type out whatever it was in a template, I mean, there is a tremendous amount of time saved for them. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's a real benefit, right? So there's definitely an ROI. That being said, there's also a real concern. Do I think
Mm-hmm.
security can put the brakes on this? No, I don't think we should. I don't think we can. And frankly, by the way, I think that those training concerns that people are being educated on is slowing things down enough that organizations are starting to realize, oh, wait, it turns out that like I'm going to have to train our employees a lot more than I thought to enable them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not going to take our pilot from 90 to 180 users or 180 to 360 or 360 to 720. We're going to have to slow roll this a bit because the training burden is much, much higher than we thought it was going to be. So friction is being introduced without security being the party that has to introduce it. And look, we need to revel in that luxury, right? The whole Department
Yeah,
of
no
No
doubt.
thing. Yeah, we don't want that reputation again. So if the enterprise is going to encounter some other obstacles, let's let them encounter those obstacles and say, okay, while you're dealing with that, the other thing that we need to factor in here is what about our additional security controls? What about the fact that we can't control this at the database layer anymore? Or we can't control this in the same way that now someone can ask a query in a Word document. And if all that stuff's in the graph database, they can also find out what everyone else makes. And we may not want that to happen. They may be able
No
to find
doubt.
out every single supplier that we have. They may be able to
Mm-hmm.
find out every contract we're currently negotiating. You don't need to use that fear because there is an awareness of that, but you let some of that friction that's being encountered in the adoption help you start to lay the groundwork for what you need to do from a security perspective. And that's why I
That's
think
right.
your question is interesting in that the word aggressively doing a rollout of Copilot. I've seen a lot of rollouts of Copilot start
Mm-hmm.
aggressively,
Mm-hmm.
and then I've seen them kind of stall almost as quickly when you realize that if it took technologists, people that are really good at tech, to start to learn how to use this, as long as it took them, if anyone lived through an MFA rollout across the standard enterprise, right? Like, for some organizations that might have been a decade ago, but if you remember when you
Sure.
rolled out MFA, imagine rolling out a magic computer that can answer questions about all the data in your environment. It's literally just not a screen you look at and say approve and type a number. Like, it's way more than that. Just think about how the average user is going to respond to it. It is a challenge, and it's also a behavioral challenge. You've got to get someone in the habit of using it. So I think what you're going to find is that some deployments will stall, and you need to be laying that groundwork for what you're going to do from a security perspective the whole way.
Right. Right. It's you said it right. I think it really comes down to, again, if we focus on risk as security practitioners, it's not our risk to own, it's our risk
Yeah.
to report, it's our risk to identify, it's our risk to put into some type of qualitative or quantitative position that we can communicate it effectively. Because we could sit there as security practitioners and understand all the ones and zeros, and we could understand the technology through and through. And we're talking about graph API and semantic APIs and all
Yep.
that stuff. The people that own the risk and tell you yes or no don't understand it to that level, and they don't need to, because
They
these are
don't. Yep.
business leaders and owners that need to be focusing on things like innovation, things like our profit and loss, things like how are we going to get our company to the next level. So we need to talk about it in the business terms,
And
and we
Scott,
need to
the
give
one of the
options.
Yeah, and options, exactly. One of the things that I often talk about, I've sort of got what I call my war on risk for this year and last year and maybe next year. And it's not an actual war on risk because I think risk is valuable from a security
Hmm.
perspective. But what I try to talk about when it comes to risk is that risk as a language for security leaders is
Yep.
not incredibly effective.
Hmm.
Businesses are in the business of arbitraging risks, but we have an everyday language of risk that we use as people. And that everyday language of risk is about trade-offs. That's what we do every day, right? The
Yep.
folks who joined this session, they made a trade-off, right? They knew it was me and Scott, so it was going to be amazing. So they traded off doing something else so they could join this and listen to it,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And hopefully we've lived up to the responsibility they
Hopefully,
entrusted us
hopefully.
with. Yeah. But that's a trade-off, right? You
Yeah.
everyone's busy, so there could have been things that you were doing, but you wanted to get something out of this session. And that's what I think security teams need to do. Instead of talking about risk and annualized loss expectancy and
Yeah, yeah,
quantitative
yeah,
and
yeah.
qualitative, it's like, look, here's our trade-off. Yeah, we can absolutely enable a technology that is going to help everyone be more productive once they learn it. However, it's also going to put data in their hands that we didn't realize was going
It's
to be in
fair.
their hands because we don't have the governance that we need. And that's another project we need to run to make sure that someone can't get that. And that's the trade-off, right? Is do we want to empower the employees and are we willing to accept the trade-off that this is going to potentially lead to more insider events, to more
Hmm.
information being shared unintentionally or accidentally beyond the borders that you might want it shared. And if that trade-off is worth it, that's great. Because to your point, we're not the risk owner. I want the business leaders that the CISOs I work with, I want those business leaders focused on customer obsession and growth and marketing and product.
That's right.
I don't want them learning about the configuration options for LLM A or B.
Yeah.
And what I want to do is help the security
Yeah.
leaders have that conversation so that every enterprise can adopt it the way they want. So
I
trade-offs
like,
is
yeah.
generally how I think about it.
I really like how you frame that too, because it's not that, we're talking about, because we know what the end result's going to be. We know up here as security practitioners when we're talking about risk, but you're putting it into plain language.
Yep.
You're putting it into, you do this, then that.
Yep.
Simple as that. We don't need to talk about anything great. We don't talk about any of the definitions because that's just a layer of abstraction that is going to lose your community. So it's pretty awesome to see this become more natural language. It is not a difficult thing to do, but it is difficult to get to that position of having that conversation with the right people. And the way to turn them on to this conversation is to meet them where they are, use language that they are familiar with, that isn't complicated, as well as, again, you got to give them options. These
Yep.
are a position of, these are the things that we could do, and these are the results if we do these three things. And here you are. This is your
Yep.
business. This is your decision, and that's very cool to see it in that way. Another question that we have here, we've got about 15 minutes left here, and appreciate all the back and forth here from the community. One of the things that kind of goes right in line with what we were just talking about is what should enterprises consider in order to create governance and policies related to using Gen AI when there really isn't much out there around, for speaking to us as security community, risks around AI.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, again, it goes back to the use cases. You've got to understand what your organization wants to do with generative AI, whether it's using an AI coding assistant, a Turing bot to generate
Mm-hmm.
more code, which yes is going to make your developers more productive. Well, okay, that's a use case. Now what you need to do is then go and assess what's your CI/CD pipeline look like? What is your application security maturity? Do you have, if you have a problem with having code quality issues, right, which become a security concern, well, if you add 30 to 40% more code per developer, then you've now got a bigger code quality problem. So it exacerbates what you're doing. So part of that is understanding what the use cases are so that you can figure out what you need to do from a security perspective to enable that, what those threats and risks are, and then also what trade-offs you're making and what compensating controls are going to be necessary in order for you to do that. If you're suddenly going to have a lot more code written because your development teams want to leverage that technology, by the way, they probably should. Okay, well, what that means is that we're going to need to look at investing more heavily in application security personnel.
Mm-hmm.
We might need to work with the development team to have a human in the loop process. Here's one of my favorite ones to ask about code that's generated. Do you need to mark code that is generated by a Turing bot or by a coding assistant? Do you need to identify that code in some capacity? Does it need to be commented? Because you have regulations that say that you need to have things like reliability and fairness, anti-bias, alignment concerns around AI. Well, do you need to know whether or not your developer used generated code? How do you trace that back in a stack of code? That's virtually impossible.
Right.
And look, I'm also aware that like a lot of enterprise software out there is built on copying and pasting from Stack Overflow. So I don't want to pretend, like, hey, like this is a new
But
issue.
a
But
human had to copy and paste, right? There was a button
exactly,
click
at
in there.
least a person, yeah, at least a person copied and pasted. But so that's one example. But guess what? Your marketing team that wants to use this to generate, abstracts and content marketing and things like that, that's a really different use case. That's not code.
Right.
That's
Right.
marketing material, but do you still want a human in the loop review process? So it's really about security breaking down barriers and working with a lot of these other teams. And your policy is going to look different. In fact, we're working on a policy document. It's almost done. It's going to be out soon. And one of the things that really differentiates that from sort of legacy policies is that instead of it being a whole bunch of thou shalt nots, it's a lot more of thou shalt. So it's sort of like, here are the tools you can use. Here are the use cases that are approved from a departmental perspective. Here's the process of governance once you've used these tools to release something. And instead of it being, don't look at bad things or, only use our data this way, instead it's, here's an example of what you can do with it. Here's an example of what you can't. So it requires a
Right.
lot more collaboration between security and those other groups.
Yeah. Which only echoes the fact that now security can be seen as an enabler to the business and be more integrated in the day to day, not from the culture of no.
Yep.
This did not and has not worked. We see the breach reports every year continue to skyrocket. We're not going down. We need to plateau and we need to decrease for sure, but we need to get to some point. And how we do that is to become effective in the business, having effective conversations about how are we going to get to where we need to be as an organization in the right way. And let's figure out
Yeah.
what those trade-offs are. So it's really cool to have something like this here right now. I certainly I don't envy anyone in the position of leading a security team
Yeah.
today with this. Having been there for so long, it gives me heartburn still. But still, it's a real opportunity. Now there's the human change element that needs to happen with the technology change that's taking place. That's going to get us to a better position and a better place of where we're trying to get to. And so there's another question here that is, what typical controls can you advise for AI? And that's from Ben. I've got my take on this, but I'm going to let you start there, Jeff.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, kind of an impossible question to answer because there are so many
Mm-hmm.
that could exist or things you need to do. But kind of as we mentioned before, an AI deployment is going to exacerbate a lot of existing issues, whether we're talking about users using AI or whether we're talking about developers training models.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a lot of different things that are going to happen as a result. And so in that vein, what you really need is that those existing security processes, procedures, that maturity level, your current security posture, all of those things are going to be affected by what type of AI you're deploying because this sits in so many different categories. And so without good knowledge of that, it's kind of difficult to answer. Do I think that you need to have solid data maturity and data governance?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Do you need strong IAM for entitlements and access? 100%.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about code generation, do you need strong application security? Absolutely, you do. So the real question is taking it back to those use cases and having a strong view of your environment and a well-assessed view of your environment to recognize where your deficiencies are, then understanding where those shortfalls are. Are there going to be some new controls you need to introduce? Yeah, absolutely. Right. You're probably
Mm-hmm.
going to need something that inserts itself between the prompt and the cloud, so to speak. Right. So that way you can interdict or intervene if someone's going to get some information that you wouldn't want them to have. That might be a new category of control. But at the same time,
Right.
you really need to make sure that the existing stuff you have is up to par or above par for you to really do this well. I'm curious, what do
Right.
you think, Scott?
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to the fundamentals. It's the element of what are we attempting to control? We need to understand what we have as a business. The sensitive, the regulated, the compliance, the intellectual property. This is key. I have yet to see, well, I can't say that. I have seen a couple, but it was a little bit bigger. But I would say from a compliance perspective, compliance is great. It is a great baseline, but there's compliance and there's security. Compliance, under most circumstances, is not going to shut the doors on a business, depending on the market you're in or the industry you're in, because it has the capability of doing so. But that business may survive just under different ownership. From a position of security, intellectual property is everything. What are your secrets? What are the things that could end up in the hands of a competitor, or it could be taken from an employee that's on their way out the door, that ends up in the wrong hands one way or another. You need to understand where that is, who and what has access to it. How are they getting that access? Is it from a configuration basis? Is it from an ACL? Is it from a sharing link? Is it from a private channel? Is it sitting in the cloud X or Y or Z, or regardless? Because we're far away from the days of 30 years ago where there was a locked filing cabinet and one person had the key, maybe a second person if we were worried about that person getting hit by a bus. But now that same level of information that's in these filing cabinets is everywhere. Data sprawl is everywhere. So we also need to understand how it's being used. And this kind of goes back into the element of, okay, now we have LLMs that are going to go and do some action against this data. Well, we need to understand how that looks. So if we get to the basis of understanding and getting rid of permissions, getting to a least privilege, we're fantastic. It's been in our taxonomy for eons, let's say, ever since information security kind of came up. Least privilege was key. This is something that's almost never achieved by organizations. We need to understand the threat models that are out there. So Jeff, you talked about a lot of the use cases. Every use case has a distinct threat model. There might be threat models that could be applied to several use cases that are in the same containers. But at the end of the day, we need to understand what those threat models are. And then we also have to understand how things are being utilized that are going to exploit those threat models. And we need to just empower our users with information. So whether it is a scenario of you are a data owner and you need to do an entitlement review, let's try to clear we don't want to walk into a data owner and say, here is 5,000 people in our 5,000 people organization that have access to this data. Like you're going to get thrown out of their office. But if you can get to a position of saying, okay, we've eliminated, we're just focusing on the people that are using this data in the last 6 months or year, it's going to be far less than all of them. And we also have some opportunity here of seeing what are the interactions and how people are using them, because key to this, again, is human change management. And it's if we understand how people are using AI, we have the ability to start to educate and train them and communicate to them in effective ways that is going to make a significant change in what we're doing. On the code side, the application security, the network segmentation, the identity and access management, these are core pillars that have been a part of information security for forever. So to answer that question, what typical controls is use case, threat model, look at the foundation of everything that we're trying to do, double down on that and try to leverage, the community at large, because the upside now is we're not the first adopters of information security everywhere. There are some shining lights out there in the world that are doing it extremely, extremely well.
Yep.
So we've got about 6 minutes here. I do want to open up the poll here. Haley did provide us and will be pushing this up on screen. We really do appreciate you spending time with us today. We'd like to have your feedback at the very least to understand, number one, Jeff and I, we got up here, we got to the position of meeting each other and providing hopefully a good show for you. I was very impressed with you, Jeff, to be able to see and have this conversation with you. I feel like I'm much more informed by the end of the day here in the end of this hour. So it was a very good, effective use of my time. I'm hoping the same for everybody else here. Really appreciate you doing that. So with 5 minutes, Jeff, anything that you'd like to say to close us out?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would say is get in front of this. A lot of the stuff that we've said so far, get in front of this, help the organization adopt it. There is a broad awareness of the security implications of this technology in a way that we've never seen before, which makes it such a tremendous opportunity to be someone that's seen as enabling a technology innovation for an enterprise as opposed to introducing friction. So take advantage of that, seize the opportunity while you've got it, because I just can't think of any other tech where security's ever had a chance to do what we've had a chance to do here. That's my sort of takeaway and advice I'd share.
Yeah, and I'm going to double down. I think this is an opportunity for all of the security practitioners, the IT, security focused IT, get in the game. That this isn't a function of tactical work anymore. You are a strategist at the end of the day. Work on your communication, being able to communicate to the senior leaders using their language, understanding what they care about, and applying what you do on a day-to-day basis to enabling AI. It's here. It's not going to go away. Be in front of it, not behind it, and make this world a safe and secure place. And it's up to all of us to continue down this path. So I really do appreciate you, Jeff, and appreciate the team here on the phone with us and everybody that took an hour and everyone that will be watching this and recording. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great, great, wonderful day. and let's fight the good fight. Take care.